that is consistent with the number that he has, right?
That is correct.
And would it be fair to say that the only really cross-references you did with reference to this handset number was between Luis Rivera, Sigfredo Garcia, Catherine McManua, and the Adelsons, correct?
No, sir. There were a number, if you're talking about persons involved, obviously, as I spoke earlier, one of the first things we do is a frequency report to see who it communicates with most frequently. That information was given to the investigators so that they could begin researching all of those numbers. And I do not know the extent to which they identified numbers of importance. When it came to the relevance, here it was between those primary parties, but anyone the handset communicated with was evaluated to some degree or another.
Now, you're aware that Mr. Rivera was part of a criminal organization known as the Latin Kings, correct?
Yes.
Did you at any point or anybody in law enforcement do a cross-section between known Latin Kings and this phone number?
There were a number of contact information. So during the course of the investigation, we developed associated names with phone numbers. Those were provided to me from a variety of sources. One of them was from a previous investigation that involved a number of the people that you're speaking of. And those contact information was added to our automated system and would populate if there were previously known people. Again, that information was provided to the investigators, and whatever relevance that may or may not have been would have been their determination.
Do you know if anybody that's in that list that you discussed had communication with Luis Rivera from May 28th till June 4th?
No one that I'm aware of.
You're saying no one had communication or no one has that information?
Oh, I'm sorry. May I understand your question?
Sure. Let me rephrase it. I'm sorry. So you indicated that there's known Latin Kings that were communicating with Luis Rivera, right?
I'm saying that I was provided with contact phone numbers that were populated, and I do not know if there was communication between them or not. Again, that information is provided to the investigators, knowing who those people are. They're just phone numbers to me.
Well, you know that they had a wire intercept of Luis Rivera's phone from, I believe, October to November of 2014, correct?
Yes, sir.
All right. And you're aware that during that wire intercept, known gang activity between Luis Rivera and other gang members was intercepted, right?
I do not know the specifics of the intercept. That was a different investigation, but it is the criminal investigation that I mentioned. We did receive some of the contact information from that investigation. And so if there were names there, then they were added into our system, and that information was given to the investigators.
So the question I have is, those names, do you have a frequency report, or are you aware of any of those names having contact with this number for the week prior to June 4th?
I am not personally aware, no.
Did you do any kind of analysis to determine if any of those calls were made?
Outside of what I've mentioned, as far as any of the names that we have, or providing those phone numbers to the investigators that were familiar with that investigation and this one, I did no further investigation.
Now, if you could go to the next slide, please.
I'm sorry, you mean?
It was the map. There it is. Okay. On the bottom right-hand corner, at 1:40 a.m., that is a ping for Luis Rivera's phone, correct?
It is a cell site that his handset was utilizing, yes.
Well, every reference I make is with regards to a cell site indicating or activating to a number associated with Luis Rivera, okay?
Yes, sir.
The next one at 3:13, that's also a ping for Luis Rivera's phone, correct?
Let me clarify one thing for these overview maps. There may be multiple activations of that cell site, of one particular cell site, and all of those events, there may be 4 or 5 of them together, all of those events will be shown at once on this. And the labeling works so that only the last event you're going to see. So if we want to talk about specifics, this is a very general overview map. If we want to talk about specifics, then I can look in here, and this is actually only one event at 1:40 a.m. I just want to make sure that there may be more than one event that communicated with a particular cell site, even though there's only one dot on the map.
Let me maybe I'm asking it too complicated. All these little, can you expand the map, Sergeant? There we go. All those blue dots, those are in reference to location information for Luis Rivera's handset phone, correct?
That is correct.
Go to the next slide, please. This is the following day, correct?
It is, yes, sir.
And you'll agree with me from 3:25 p.m., which is the top left-hand corner, all the way down to 12:47 a.m. Those are Luis Rivera's. Those are associated with Luis Rivera's handset, correct?
That's correct.
Now, Judge, I'm going to ask to approach so I can show the witness, with all due respect, which slide I'm referring to, if I may, Your Honor.
You may.
If you could be kind enough to pull this up, Sergeant. Thank you so much, sir.
Sure.
Okay. Now, this slide, there is a flag with a yellow, there's a yellow flag in the middle of the screen, correct?
There is.
And what does it say? It says Rivera's residence right underneath there. Is that correct?
It does, yes.
And you have testified to the members of this jury with relation to that location being where Luis Rivera lives, correct?
Yes, sir.
If I may, Judge?
You may.
You could be kind enough. Sergeant, I apologize. When you're ready, let me know.
Yes, sir.
If you could pull that up for the members of the jury. Oops. Okay, now, you'll agree with me that the map that we just looked at from June 4th to June 5th was related to Luis Rivera's handset, correct?
That's correct.
And you'll also agree with me that the yellow flag that you had highlighted a location in North Miami, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now here, on what I believe has already been introduced into the evidence as a traffic citation for Luis Rivera, his address there is 1805 Normandy Drive, Apartment 3, correct?
That's what's listed, yes.
Now I know when you get pulled over, you give a police officer your license, right?
Yes.
Or I'm sure you've done it the other way around. If you pulled someone over, you ask for license and registration. So, in addition to that, we have a car rental agreement, correct?
We do.
Okay. And that car rental agreement that I'm referring to is when Mr. Rivera rents a Prius in this case. You recall that?
Yes.
There we go. And if you could, I don't know if you can highlight it, but if we could just look at the top right-hand corner, top left-hand corner. That appears to be Luis Rivera writing his name, correct?
I'm not familiar with his handwriting, but it is a handwritten, his name, yes.
Correct. And underneath that, which address does Luis Rivera himself on this car rental agreement provide as his home address?
The 1805 Normandy Drive.
And that would be consistent with what's on his driver's license. Is that correct, sir?
It would be.
Okay, now, if I could show you another map, if you don't mind. Here we go. May I approach, Judge?
You may.
This one, sorry, I don't know. Is there a number here?
No, there's not. Just give me the date, 15.
June 15th. Okay.
That one.
Now, you're not from South Florida, are you, sir?
I'm not.
And just refresh everyone's information. The address is 1805 Normandy Drive. Is that correct?
It is, yes.
And is that Normandy Drive right here?
It is, yes.
And is that in Miami Beach consistent with what Mr. Rivera listed on the car rental agreement as well as on his driver's license?
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry. Is that the information Luis Rivera provided on his car rental agreement, correct?
Yes, it is.
As well as the address on his driver's license that was part of the citation that was issued on June 4th, correct?
That's correct.
And Normandy Drive, and that's in Miami Beach, right?
It appears to be yes.
And that located, if you could back it up, I'm sorry, one more, sorry, not a little closer. A little closer, there we go.
Sorry.
It's okay. So, according to this map, Normandy Drive is right across that little bridge between where Miss McManus' residence is. Is that correct?
Yes, I'm not familiar with the exact, where that exact numeric would be, but it would be consistent with that area, yes, sir.
Now, if you could, if you'd be kind enough, sorry, this is, if we could go back to the slide that you had that showed the yellow map of Mr. Rivera, which you indicated, which was testified under direct as his address. You could find that for me, sir?
And I'm sorry, the one we looked at previously?
The one that showed, it said Rivera's residence in yellow. Now, pardon me. What does it say right here?
North Miami?
And Luis Rivera was the Inca or the Rivera of the North Miami tribe of the Latin Kings. Is that correct?
I'm not.
If you know.
He said he did.
Okay. Now, I know that we discussed this during your last time up, but just to clarify again, the information that you receive from the cell towers is simply an approximation of the general area between accompanying towers, correct?
Well, what I received from the phone company is actually the antenna that's being used. It's the location and the direction of the cell site that's actually being utilized for that event. We simply represent that on a map and then compare it to known locations.
And so what they have is they have an antenna that could be at a specific location, and a vehicle could be at the farthest reaching perimeter of where that antenna's radius is, and it would relate to that antenna, correct?
Well, a handset is going to choose the cell site that it sees with the best available signal. And there are a lot of factors that influence that decision. I guess the answer to your question is yes, a handset at the furthest reaches of the effective range of that tower would still communicate with that tower.
So there's no way to know specifically where a cell phone is, correct?
That's correct. And in all of these, I'm only providing a general location or a general area that may be serviced by that cell site.
Now, in all of the evaluations that you did and all the data that you complied, were you able to determine if any of the other antennas were down or not serviceable at the time?
We look at things like use to determine if other cell sites are maybe not in service. There's no indication, particularly looking at if we know they're being communicated with, if we know we have events that are communicating with those cell sites, then we know those cell sites are functional. So that's kind of one thing that we look at. But again, we're only looking at a very general location of where that handset is and asking if the location of interest may be serviced by that particular cell site and sector. And that's all we're attempting to do.
So you'll agree with me that you can't tell who's using a specific handset at the time other than the numbers being used, correct?
That's correct.
And based on the records that you have, you can't use or you can't prove through your phone data or through the cellular records that Mr. Garcia was on the trip in 2014, correct? In the June trip?
That is correct. We have no location information for his handset.
Now, let's go to the July 18th date, if you would, please. There was two pieces of activity related to my client's handset. One at 9:36, correct?
Yes, sir. You mean the morning of the 18th?
Yes, sir. There was two activities on his handset that day, correct?
That's correct.
One was a text message, correct?
That's correct.
And the text message was incoming, which means somebody sent it into Mr. Garcia, correct?
That's correct.
Did he respond to it?
It was a notification. As we spoke last time, it was not a full phone number, and I believe that was a notification sent to him.
Okay. Then there was a phone call that came into him, correct?
I believe so, yes.
And could you tell if that went to voicemail or if that was picked up?
I don't recall, but regardless, the duration was extremely short at 7 seconds, as we discussed.
And there was no more activity on Mr. Garcia's phone until 12:30 something, correct?
No active activity. There were incoming calls, but there was nothing active done with the handset until 12:30.
That's what I'm referring to. There was no
Yes.
active activity. Okay,
Correct.
Not any passive activity, right?
Correct.
You did a frequency report on the number associated with my client, correct?
Yes,
And who was the most frequent person that he spoke to?
Ms. Bagbanor.
And that was from when to when?
Well, I believe that holds true from just about any period of time. The initial response that we looked at was for about a 2 or 3 month period, if I remember. We can pull that up if we need to be specific.
Well, would it be fair to say, Sergeant, that it was not uncommon for there to be a substantial amount of communication between my client and the mother of his children?
That's correct.
Now, just one more time, and I hate to beat a dead horse. May I approach, Judge? Pull up the registration card. And this is the registration card for the Budget Inn in Tallahassee.
That's correct.
And that's, again, the 1805 Normandy Drive address, correct?
That's correct.
In Miami Beach?
Yes, sir.
And that's inconsistent with the address that you have highlighted, correct?
That's correct.
Give me a second, Your Honor. Judge, I'll tender the witness with a right to recall Sergeant Corbitt's.
Yes. Thank you. Hello again, Sergeant.
Hello.
Your Honor, may I reposition this just a little bit to the left? All right. Call detail records versus geolocation.
Yes, sir.
It's late in the day. I know that this is your expertise. If you could explain to the jury the difference in between call detail records and geolocation.
Well, I think when you speak of geolocation, you're probably talking about real-time location of a handset.
Let me ask you a question.
Yes.
Sorry to cut you off. So, my iPhone has Find My iPhone. Is that geolocation?
Yes, I think geolocation is kind of a broad term, but when we're talking about the call detail records, and I believe I can answer this, what you're asking, the call detail records are historical events, and they provide for us the location of the cell site that the handset was communicating with. When you're talking about applications like Find My iPhone, or where law enforcement is able to actively obtain the location of a handset, then we're talking about not the location of the cell site, but the location of the handset itself. And that information comes from a variety of sources. It could be from the cell network. It could be from a GPS receiver in the handset. It can be from Wi-Fi access points. There are a number of things that allows the handset to determine its location and then communicate that to us.
Now let's answer it with respect to accuracy. Geolocation, Find My iPhone, more accurate than call detail records, which will just give a generalized area.
In almost all cases, yes. Anything where the handset is actively trying to help us find it is going to be more accurate than a cell site location.
If I tried to find my iPhone using call detail records, I may find myself walking around an entire neighborhood trying to find it.
You could, unless you left it at your friend's house that you communicate with frequently, and we knew that address was within the cell site, then you may get lucky. But yes, the geolocation is much more accurate.
unless I get lucky with the call detail records.
Right.
Now, I want to explain a little bit how you call them antennas, right?
Yes.
Your Honor, if I could have 1 second. Let me get creative here. Dave, do you mind if I borrow your keys? Sergeant, if I were to drive north on Monroe, maybe about 2 miles, I see one of these antennas, right?
Several, yes, sir.
Now, these antennas, normally they're 360 degrees, but they're broken up into, what are they, 3 segments?
It varies by cell site, but generally what we see is, yes, they are divided into 3 sectors.
Now, with the demonstration that you had here today, I saw that at a lot of the points there's 3 arrows.
That's correct.
Does that mean that there's 3 antennas and each of them are 120 degrees?
Well, there's more than 3 antennas generally between transmit and receive, and they are not always 120 degrees. We will see a lot of cell sites that are not exactly 3 equal segments. The antennas are oriented towards the best service for that population area, and it is not always 3 exactly spaced azimuths.
So all these, now you use the big azimuth, what's that?
I did. That's the direction. When we talk about azimuth, that is that 360 degree circle. That is the degrees in which that antenna is facing.
So if one of the antennas has 3, or one of the towers has 3 antennas, it's going to be 120 degrees, 120, and 120.
No.
What's it going to
And
be?
that's what I'm saying. It depends by cell site.
Of course you, go ahead.
They are all different. A lot of them are exactly that, 3 equally spaced sectors. But we also have a number of cell sites that are not that perfect 3 equal segments. And again, those antennas are oriented in the direction to provide the most service.
Now, in a bunch of your slides, you had a tower and you had an arrow.
Yes.
Can you go to one of those? Doesn't matter which one. Okay, perfect. So, when it's got all the different little arrows next to the big arrow, is that for each sector?
It is, and in this case, we actually have 2 different technologies on this cell site, and when they added the additional technology, they kind of rotated them all. So one technology, and when I speak of technology, I mean like 3G or 4G, our data speeds, and whether we're voice over LTE or traditional kind of cell phone. So there's really 2 different technologies here that are represented by those. Each really only has 3.
All right, now your presentations are in between part 1 and part 2, right?
I'm sorry, yes.
1 second, Your Honor. If you can go to part 1, slide 4.
I'm sorry. You may want to mute me real quick, just so that as I'm switching presentations, I don't accidentally display something. Perfect, thank you. And I'm sorry, you were wanting to go back to my original presentation from my previous testimony.
No, today.
Oh.
There's two parts for today.
I see.
Let's go to the first one, which I believe is in June.
And I'm not sure exactly which is slide 4 on your.
We'll go back.
Okay.
Just go to a random one with one of the arrows or down at my hand. How about that?
One of the arrows down in my.
Tell me when you're good enough. Turn it off.
You can turn it back on now, thanks. Oops. I'm still finding one, so. That would be one with a.
Yeah, perfect. Your Honor, if I can approach the screen? All right. Now, Sergeant, just to explain to the jury, that wouldn't be accurate as to the width of that sector, that arrow. That's just a generalized direction that you're giving, right?
That is correct. That is just, well, it's accurate to the direction, That arrow is pointing the direction that that antenna is facing. It does not represent the width. And as we talked about when I was here last time, we look at where those sectors are oriented, and we estimate that somewhere about in between, about halfway in between where those sectors are pointed is where we would expect a handset to transition.
So for example, here on our easel, if we have one of these sectors that's at 120 degrees, it wouldn't go in a straight line out from it. It would expand in width, right?
That is correct, yes.
All right, now, our antenna's falling down. Now, these aren't set up right next to each other. Many times, based on where they're set up, they're miles away, right?
That's correct, yes.
Now, in a dense place like Miami, you would agree that these are miles and miles away from each other.
What I see generally here, and this is actually the layout of the towers, they're about 1 mile to 1.5 miles apart in most cases.
So it wouldn't be right next to it, it would be...
That's correct.
Okay, we won't have to set up
Now,
another.
which system are you showing here, Sergeant?
This is the cell sites, the Sprint cell sites from 2014. Yes, sir.
All right, now we'll come back to this in a second. Let's just talk about, and you said it, what you're here to do and what you're not here to do. You're not here to give an exact location like find my iPhone, right?
That's correct.
You're here to include and exclude locations.
That is correct.
The state came to you, they asked you if a certain handset could be at an address during an event, right?
That's correct.
I believe that you said it to co-defendant counsel that you're not here to make a determination of how close the phone is to the actual tower.
That's correct.
And again, these towers are miles apart from each other.
They are.
It could be right up next to the tower, or it could be almost to another tower.
That's
right?
correct.
In a nutshell, you're here to say that the handset could have been within the range of that tower, right?
Well, the handset was definitely within the range of the tower because we know that it communicated with that tower. But is more specific than that? No.
So, let's use an example. I'm going to have to set it up for this. Your Honor, if you don't mind if I set up another one?
That's right.
So, we're miles away now. We have another tower. These two towers have antennas that are pointing in the same location. All right? Now, the signal that's coming from this tower, we'll call this tower A. It doesn't just go up and all of a sudden drop off a cliff, right?
That's correct.
And neither does that happen, we'll call that one tower B.
Correct.
Now, this tower seems to not want to cooperate and keeps falling over. Let's say something happens to it. It's being serviced, it's being maintenance. This one goes down. I could be within the vicinity of tower A, but get picked up on tower B, right?
You could, yes.
Because that signal doesn't just drop off a cliff.
That's correct.
It's a system of redundancy.
It's a system of the most efficient layout. The purpose of the cellular companies is to provide exactly what they need to and not waste energy, not waste towers, not waste resources. So it's laid out very efficiently. There is and there has to be overlap so that, as you say, the signal does not just end. There is overlap from one cell site to another, and that allows us seamless travel. We can get in a car and drive, and in theory, you don't drop the phone call because there is that overlap, and as we transition from one cell site to another.
Overlap.
Yes.
Now, you can't give an absolute as to a person's location with call detail records, right? Not talking about the handset, talking about a person's location, right?
With the call detail records that we're using here, no.
Well, the first thing there's unknown variables. One of them being you don't know who has the handset.
That's correct.
That's why we say handset instead of the person, right?
That's correct.
Now, with respect to your analysis, that's also believing that the system, and when I say system, Tower A, Tower B, all the towers in Miami, that they're all working as they should be, right?
That's part of it, yes.
That they're working normally.
Yes.
Although it is rare, we saw it with Tower A, every now and then they go out of service. It's rare, but they go out of service.
That's correct.
It could be maintenance, right?
Yes,
It could be a storm, right?
yes,
Or it could just be electronics breaking.
it could be, yes,
We've seen it for the past 2 weeks in this courtroom.
we have.
You can get records of when things were maintenance or when they were down, right?
Sometimes we can, yes,
Sometimes.
correct.
We don't have it in this case, though, do we?
We do not.
They were never obtained,
They were not.
nor were they requested.
That's correct.
So again, we're assuming that this system was working normally.
Again, we know from the records, the cell sites and sectors that were working, because those are the ones the handset was communicating with. Those in and of themselves tell us the approximate or general area that handset could be in, and is enough for us to make that determination. If we were trying to get extremely granular and take my general area and bring it down into something more specific, then that's the kind of information that we would want to do. But for our purposes, it's unnecessary.
When you say granular, what you're talking about is to get more detailed, right?
That's correct.
So we could get more detailed with this information, but we've just chosen not to.
In some cases, it's possible. I would say that it is impractical to do. We've looked at hundreds, if not thousands, of different cell sites and sectors, and to obtain the information, to do drive tests, to do the software, the engineering, all the things that requires, I would say is an impossible task in this case.
Sergeant, when is it more practical? When is it more reasonable than in a murder trial?
Well,
Overruled, you can answer.
I think it's always important. Anytime that we utilize the cell site information, it is important to do what we can. Again, for our purposes and what we looked at in knowing the cell sites that are used and knowing the places of interest, and we compare those continually with other known events, places where we knew people to be from other evidence, then we're able to corroborate that information. And that's the way that we use the records.
So you say because it works normally in other locations, it must have worked normally here on these dates?
What I'm saying is that for the locations I analyzed, be it a residence or a hotel or whatever, that location was well within the coverage area of the cell site and sector that was utilized. And I don't really need to know to evaluate that one location. That's all that I need.
Sergeant, I want to pull you back over to getting what we were talking about, which is maintenance records, outages, stuff like that. Now, you said that it would be, cumbersome to get that, I think granular was your word, or I use detailed, to get that detailed, that it would be a big process. We're just talking about one day here. We're talking about June 2nd, 2014, for a handful of towers. You could have gotten documents to find out if any of those towers went down, right?
I don't know for sure those documents were available. And for us, we're not talking about just one day or one event. We were looking at weeks and months worth of events, and then sometimes years worth of events that encompass thousands and thousands of cell sites.
Sergeant, correct me if I'm wrong. You had 2 presentations here today, right?
That's correct.
One of them was for a few days in June,
Yes, sir.
and the other was for a few days in July.
That's correct.
And we're talking about 10, 20, 30 towers on pretty much all of those dates between Miami and Tallahassee, right?
You're looking at many more towers than that.
Okay. Just taking, for example, June 4th. You could have gotten for the 10 towers down in Miami to send a subpoena, say we want to find out on June 4th whether those towers were operational for the full day. That could have been done.
There's a possibility that information exists.
But we don't have it.
We do not.
Now, let's change gears. During the course of this case, for the year since it's happened, you've been in close communication, of course, with the investigators in your building at the Tallahassee Police Department, right?
I have, yes.
And also the FBI.
Yes.
In fact, you've had frequent conversations with the FBI.
Well, I think you said immediately after the incident and for the first, years of the investigation. Yes, absolutely. That has certainly trailed off, after.
You would agree frequent conversations, though, at some point.
Yes.
More towards the beginning,
Yes.
before the arrests were made.
Yes.
And that information was then put into reports written by your colleagues at the Tallahassee Police Department, right?
It was.
And also the FBI,
I believe so, yes.
in what's called their 302 reports.
I believe so, yes.
You being a sergeant, many years on the force, married to a prosecutor, you then know that those reports, once arrests are made, are given over to defendants,
Correct.
like Luis Rivera.
Correct.
Correct me if I'm wrong, you gave detailed, step by step by step, the direction of calls, the locations, all of that, to be put into reports for discovery in this case.
I certainly provided all of that information to the investigators. What they chose to document or what was necessary to document to establish probable cause, that's their determination.
But it's your understanding that they put all your details into reports that were later given to Luis Rivera.
They didn't put all my details in, but they certainly did put at least some in.
If you could go to, now I'm going to refer to what you've presented here as presentation 1 and 2. Presentation 1 is for June,
Yes.
presentation 2 is for July.
For me, they're all one presentation. They just happen to have been printed in 2 sections for you, that's all. That's
I'll make it easier. If you can go to the June stuff,
okay?
pages 11 through 12. Start with page 11, please.
And I'm not sure exactly which page 11 is. Again,
You could show on what page you're talking about it, well, it's just in this.
Oh, on our side, we have a PDF, so we get page
Oh,
numbers.
okay. I'm sorry, that's you, had the page.
If I can approach. So I'll do this for you. I'll show it to you.
okay. So that's
So it's going to be those two.
with that one and the next one. Yep, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Now, your testimony was that Miss Magban was handset, leaves the area of Miami Beach, travels over to Comfort Rent-A-Car, right?
To the area, yes.
And you know the relevance of that to this case,
Yes,
because a car was rented at Comfort Rent-A-Car.
that's correct.
All right. And using your language, it's consistent with her being in the area of a tower around 853 and 858, right?
That's correct.
If you can zoom in at all, so we don't need to go to the next slide. You can just zoom in here for me. You can go a little bit to the left. It's also consistent with dropping somebody off the airport, right?
It could be, yes.
Also consistent with dropping off the father of your children to go rent a car, right?
Could be, yes.
No information here that ties her then to a murder.
That's correct.
And you wouldn't conclude that, would you?
I would not.
If you can go 3 slides forward, it's a slide that had Geico. There we go, Geico Insurance. Now, of course, you know that it's Geico Insurance because you took the 800 number and you ran it and you found out.
That's correct.
Who do you have for insurance?
Who do I have?
Yeah.
Progressive.
All right. Now, you know, like most of these big companies, that those calls are recorded, right?
They could be, yes.
No subpoena sent to Geico to find out. Oh, bless you. I didn't know what was going on. No subpoena sent to Geico to find out what was going on in that phone call, right?
I did not. I'm not aware of a subpoena sent for that particular phone call.
All right. Let's go 3 slides forward. I think it was the one about Rivera's residence. Yeah, we can use that one. Who told you that's Rivera's residence?
The investigators in the case,
Which investigator?
Isom and Sanford.
Didn't tell you whose residence that actually is?
Jessica Rodriguez,
Then why doesn't it say Jessica Rodriguez up there?
because it was where the information given to me is that's where Mr. Rivera was staying.
If you could go forward, give me a second. 25. Here's a slide, it's about 25 on our end, it's about 10 forward. It's the one with the citation for Luis Rivera. This isn't the only place in this case where this address shows up, right?
That's correct.
It's it repeats itself more in the discovery in this case than him staying at Jessica Rodriguez's house, right?
As far as, and again, the information given to me by the investigators is based upon their interviews, their research, their information. And regardless of what it may list on a driver's license or list on an application, where he's physically laying his head at night is determined by more than just paperwork.
Give me 1 second, number 47. Yeah, Sergeant Corbitt, could you punch in the Normandy address on your computer so that we can see that?
You'll need to mute me first, please. All right, sir.
City's ready.
Yeah.
So this is a clean map, but this would be the address listed for the 1805 Normandy Drive.
You can zoom up. Zoom back in just a little bit, keeping in the bottom right here. Correct me if I'm wrong, that's where Captain McVanwell lives?
That's correct.
All right, so fast forwarding in your direct examination, at one point in time, you were asked about Charles Adelson's whereabout on July 15th,
That's correct.
and that he was in the prosecution emphasized that he was in the location, Captain McVanwell.
That's correct, yes.
These towers are miles apart, right?
Yes, they are.
And Luis Rivera lives just around the corner. Right?
Yes.
Where does Maria Rivera live, his sister?
I do not know.
You're not aware that she lives in the same neighborhood?
I'm not.
What about Luis Rivera's mother?
I do not.
What about the mother of his other children?
I do not.
Would you agree with me that the information that you have as the whereabout of Charles Adelson on 7/15 is also consistent with him being at Luis Rivera's house?
Certainly the address, this Normandy Drive address, could not be excluded from that cell site. That's correct.
So it is consistent with him being at that address.
Yes.
Give me a second, Jerron. I'm going to get another page number here. We're going to go to the July stuff now.
All right.
And for me, it's the 9th slide.
Yeah, again, I'm sorry, my presentation doesn't have page numbers.
What page number is this?
If I can just approach a witness, I can show.
So, which day? July.
Now bring in the computer. 1 second, Jerron.
Yep.
All right. This is a summary, right?
It is, yes.
This isn't accurate for all the communications by all these people for those days.
That's correct. It is filtered down to the persons of interest.
For instance, Captain McVanwell, in between the communications between her and Charles Adelson, had a bunch of other communications with other people.
She may have, yes. We can certainly go back to the raw records and look at those.
What's been done here is that you have the records of Charles Adelson, Catherine McVanwell, and Sequestration Garcia, and you're pulling the bits and pieces and then stacking them together and removing out all of the other communications that they're having to make it look like one after the other, after the other, after the other are the communications that are happening.
Sustained.
You would agree with me that there were a lot of other communications that Captain McVanwell was having that day with other people.
Yes, there were.
Now, at one point in direct examination, you said that certain communications on July 14th and 15th were consistent with her having dinner with Charles Adelson.
That's correct.
And again, you get that language, you get that statement because you also have all of his iMessages for around that time?
I don't know if we have all of them, but we certainly have a significant number.
Now, none of these phone calls are recorded.
That's correct.
You don't know what's being talked about.
That's correct.
But these text messages help put into context some of those communications.
They do.
Brief second here, we pull up another slide. You know which one
Yes,
that is?
yes.
Now, same thing's going on here, right? There's a whole bunch of other communications that Captain McBain was having that day that aren't in that summary, right?
That's correct.
Do you have anything to present to this jury that shows any other days, random days, as to the type of communications that were being had in between Catherine McBanois and Sigfredo Garcia, and Catherine McBanois and Charles Adelson?
But certainly, we have all of her records. We can look at any of that.
Now, those records, they begin in May of 2014, right?
That's correct.
You remember that prior to your examination, I provided over to you some parts of those call records to take a look at them, right?
That's correct.
The main ones? I'm handing you, it's been pre-marked as Defense Exhibit 8. You know what that is, right?
I do.
That's one of the spreadsheets that I gave you with the state's evidence, right?
It is.
You've had a chance to review that,
I have the records themselves, yes, sir.
and it accurately reflects what's in the records, right?
It does, yes.
And the one that I've just handed you is in same or substantially the same condition of the one that you have, right?
Yes.
You ought to move in what's been pre-marked as Defense 8.
Sir, objection. To be admitted.
Now, Sergeant, correct me if I'm wrong, Defense 8, it's for a time frame of May 1st and May 2nd, 2014, right?
It is, yes.
Now, that wasn't a date of interest for this case, was it?
I do not know that it was.
That's 2.5 months before the murder?
Correct.
No indication that anything was going on that day?
None that I'm aware of.
No request from the state attorney's office to hone in on that day and take a look, right?
No.
Now, what we've done here is that we've highlighted the phone numbers of different participants, right?
Correct.
Sigfredo Garcia is in green. Charles Adelson is in blue, right?
Yes.
Same volley of phone calls on a random date, right?
Yes, there is back and forth communication.
No different than the dates in June, the dates in July, right?
Only different in time, duration, but yes, there is regular communication between them.
Where Catherine will talk to Sigfredo, the father of her children, hang up the phone, call Charles Adelson, the guy she's dating, then maybe communicate back with Sigfredo, Mr. Garcia, communicate back with Mr. Adelson. That's normal throughout all the call activity that you have for her, right?
Again, there are a number of communications back and forth between all of them.
But there's nothing peculiar about the activity on the dates in June and July when compared to other random dates, right?
Again, none that I'm aware of.
On your June stuff, you had a slide that showed the locations for the drive in June. You remember that?
Yes, sir.
Can you pull that one up?
You bet the overall drive?
There we go.
I'm sorry? You mean the overall drive, this one?
That's the one.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong, this shows that there's a believed trip between 12 a.m. and 3, what time? No, 3 a.m. to 12 a.m.? What's the time frame of this trip?
Well, we have an event at 1:40 a.m. that would be consistent with the North Miami area, and then by 3:13, they're well onto Alligator Alley on 75, and that
I'm
can...
going to object to the classification of they. The only evidence here is Louis Rivera's handset.
Let's talk about the handset.
Yes, sir. And to finish your answer, that handset arrives in Tallahassee around 12:38 p.m.
What's the span of the trip? There was a lot going on between the government and co-defendant. I didn't hear it.
There would be at least 8 to 10 hours, probably
No.
8 to 9 hours.
What's the start time?
The start time is somewhere after 1:40 and prior to 3:13 for those
Arrival
events.
time?
And arrival time was 12:38 p.m.
I'm handing you with the pre-marked. This is defense 7. You know what that is, right?
Yes, sir.
That's another spreadsheet that I gave you for Catherine McBanwell's call records.
Yes, sir.
And those are the call records around the time of that trip, right?
They are, yes.
And those are in the same or substantially same condition they were in when you last reviewed them, right?
Yes, sir.
Move in defense 7.
You do have a call that's repeating here. You've actually copied the
1 second, Your Honor.
top 2, I think. I think this call was repeating whatever. I think you may have captured the top 2 rows instead of just the top 1.
Move in defense 7.
Is there objection?
Yes, if there's a document is inaccurate.
Say what?
Based on the testimony, the document is not accurate reflection of the records.
Want to clarify with him the foundation?
Sergeant, the copy that I gave you, did it have that line on it?
I believe so. I don't have that in front of me, and I'm just looking at the calls. 6464. It appears just that the top call, the very first call on this list, repeats across the pages. Other than that, it would appear to be correct.
Sergeant, do you have a pen on you?
I do.
Can you cross out what you think is repeated?
Here's some.
Thanks, sir.
So you say it's accurate now?
Yes, sir.
No objection.
It'd be admitted. 7, defend McBanaway, Exhibit 7.
Sergeant, the government on your direct examination asked you about some statements made by Louis Rivera with respect to Wendy Adelson. You remember that?
I do, yes.
Now, you also know the testimony by Louis Rivera that he says that on trip 1 up to Tallahassee, that Sigfredo was constantly on the phone with Catherine McBanwell, right?
I'm not aware of that specific statement, no.
If you could, taking a look at Defense 7, show me any phone calls during that trip between Sigfredo Garcia's phone and Catherine McBanwell's phone.
Well, you have calls on the 4th at 9:55. You have calls on...
Sergeant, between the start time and the finish time.
I'm sorry. I do not, I see 9:55 a.m. would be in there, so the 9:55 a.m. call, outbound call.
Is that one phone call?
I believe so in the time frame that you're asking about, yes.
Is there a second phone call?
I do not see one, again, in the time frame.
And what is the duration of that one phone call?
29 seconds.
Would you consider that to be constantly on the phone call in a, 8-hour drive?
I would not.
Sergeant, I'm handing you has been pre-marked as defense 9. You know what that is, right?
Yes, sir.
Those are the same type records for the trip between July 16th and July 18th?
That's correct.
And those are in same or substantially same condition they were in the last time you saw it?
Yes.
Move in defense 9.
I beg your pardon, I'm sorry.
Move in defense 9, Your Honor.
Is there objection?
There you go.
All right, be admitted.
Sergeant, since you're aware of some of Luis Rivera's testimony, are you aware of the testimony that he gave that the day before the murder,
There, I object to asking about the testimony of another witness.
Sustained.
are you aware of Luis Rivera's information that he gave prior to his testimony in trial about seeing Wendy Adelson on Trescott Drive?
I am aware of, yes.
And that specifically, he said prior to his testimony that after seeing her, he had a conversation with Sequestration Garcia, and that before noon that day, which would be...
Did you need something? I'm sorry. Were you trying to signal something? Oh, okay. Maybe you needed a pad or something. Okay.
the day before, which would be July 17th, that he said that Sigfredo called Catherine before noon that day.
I'm not aware of that. I am aware of the reported sighting of Ms. Adelson and was asked to evaluate location information for that possibility. I'm not aware of any subsequent stated communication.
Now again, the records that you have in front of you, those are the government's exhibit, just we've color-coded it so that you can easily identify the phone numbers, right?
That's correct.
Were you asked by this government to find out if Sigfredo Garcia actually called Catherine McBanois before noon on July 17th, like he said?
I do not recall being specifically asked that, no.
Can you do that for us here today now?
I can, yes.
Is there a phone call from Sigfredo Garcia to Catherine McBanois on July 17th before noon?
Not in these records, no.
You say not in these records. Are there other records that would more accurately reflect Miss McBanois' cell phone records on that day?
No, there's not.
Those are all...
For this particular phone, these particular records, there's not.
No phone call from Sigfredo Garcia to Catherine McBanois before noon on July 17th.
That's correct.
Unfortunately, we didn't have these before today, so I gotta find the page and show it to you. I'm also handing you, it's been pre-marked, is Defense 10. You know what that is, right?
I do, yes.
Those are the call detail records for Catherine McBanois on July 19th, 2014.
That's correct.
Color-coded the same way as the other exhibits we've just shown you.
That's correct.
You reviewed them prior to today,
I did, yes.
and they're in the same or substantially the same condition that they were in the last time you saw them?
Yes,
They're the same records, right?
they are.
Now, Ms. Norris asked you questions about phone calls in between Catherine McBanois and Luis Rivera on the morning of July 19th.
That's correct.
You're aware that Luis Rivera has said prior to his testimony that on the morning of July 19th, Catherine McBanois called me, right?
I am aware of that, yes.
Now, Ms. Norris asked you about this phone call right here. And you testified, yes, Catherine McBanois contacted Luis Rivera.
Correct.
But what you didn't talk about, and what you weren't asked, is the phone call right before it. That the first phone call between those two was Luis Rivera calling Catherine McBanois.
That's That's correct.
Is there a question?
There was, I can ask it again.
Wasn't a question, it was a statement.
Who called who first?
Mr. Rivera called her cell phone first,
Not the other way around.
not the other way around.
Not like what Luis Rivera said.
Well, I know generally what he said. I don't know the specifics of his statement, but as far as the records are concerned, what we see here, the first contact is from Rivera to Magbanua.
And you agree with me that Miss Norris didn't ask you about that?
I don't believe she did.
Now, if you could, there was a slide that you had that had Miss Magbanua's location with respect to, I was going to say Rivera's residence, but it's actually Jessica Rodriguez's residence on the morning of July 19th. If you could pull that up. And this is in between the times of 10:02 and 10:31.
So the 10:02 are in this one, would be the 10:02 events. If you're talking about the 10:31 event, it is this one.
Actually, let's go to a different one. We'll go chronologically. Pull this up.
Yes.
And you testified that Charlie Adelson's residence was north of her path of travel that morning, right?
That's correct.
Fits the theory of the case, right?
I assume so, yes.
Leaving Mr. Adelson's house the morning that Luis Rivera says that a money payment was made, right?
Yes.
Where does Ginger Velasquez live?
I do not know.
You weren't asked to plot that address.
That's correct.
Where does Francis Magbanua, my client's brother, live?
Very close to the Adelson Institute.
Which is also north, right around where Charles Adelson lives, right?
Further north than that, yes.
Wouldn't you agree that it's misleading to only put Charles Adelson's address there?
Objection to argument.
Sustained.
Why didn't you put these other addresses in there?
The address I was asked to look at was Mr. Adelson's to see if that address was one that could be consistent with where she was coming from, and that's what's on the map.
Asked by these prosecutors.
Also objection, argument.
Sustained. Mr. DaCosta asked earlier, we're not going to get into disparaging other counsel. I know you're going to object if they disparage defense counsel. The state attorneys are not on trial. Don't disparage opposing counsel.
Understood, Your Honor. Sergeant. You go to that slide.
Is this the first? Yeah, it's this one.
Sergeant, you have cell phone records for Luis Rivera for the morning of July 19th, right?
That's correct.
You have more than just the locations that are up there on that slide, right?
We do, yes.
You're aware that Luis Rivera says that before the phone calls of Miss Magbanua, that he was at a barber shop on Biscayne Boulevard, right?
I'm aware that he was at a barber shop.
On Biscayne Boulevard.
I don't know the exact address of the barber shop. My understanding is that it's extremely close to his residence.
To the residence that you have up there is Rivera residence, right?
That's correct.
Okay. You have his cell phone records though, right?
We do, yes.
And you were able to run his exact location that morning, right?
Exact to the point of communicating with the cell site. I mean, it's a general area that I'm offering he may be in.
You have his cell phone records for the morning of July 19th.
Yes.
Just like my client, you can look at that data to figure out his approximate location.
That's correct.
And his approximate location was not over in Miami near Jessica Rodriguez's house when those phone calls start. In fact, it was over on Normandy Island, right?
And I apologize, which phone call started? I mean, he was earlier, the first events we have for these, then yes, I do believe that he is in a location consistent with where he was staying. after these phone calls, it would be consistent with his handset moving away from that area. And to be clear, during these phone calls we're looking at here, I do believe that he was near his residence.
When these phone calls start with Miss McBanois, he's on Normandy Isle, correct?
Specifically between Mr. Rivera and Ms. McBanois, yes.
Not at a barber shop over on Biscayne Boulevard.
That's correct.
Luis Rivera also said prior to his testimony that after he was at the house, allegedly with Miss McBanois, that he and then Sigfredo Garcia go back to the barber shop. You aware of that?
Not specifically.
The data that you have, and I think it's on the same slide, where does Luis Rivera go after being in the general vicinity of Rivera's residence?
I have not plotted that, was not asked to evaluate further into the day than this, but as I recall, his handset remains fairly consistent around his house, at least in the time frame we're looking at here.
If you can go back to the slide with Miss McBanois' locations in between 10:02 and 10:31.
So this starts the 10:31 the 10:02.
Yeah. Do me a favor, you can go over Rivera's residence and zoom in. A little bit more. A little bit more. Now, all these little shaded areas, these are buildings and houses, right?
That's correct.
Isn't this also, now your testimony is it's consistent with him or her being at Jessica Rodriguez's residence, right?
That's one of the locations, yes.
But it's also consistent with being at that house, that house, that house, that apartment building, that house, right?
That's correct.
Correct me if I'm wrong. That with all the data and the technology you have, you cannot say that at any point in time, the handsets, not just talking about the people, but the handsets of Luis Rivera and Catherine McBanois were at the same place at the same time.
That's correct.
The information that you have, it's consistent with Miss McBanois looking for Mr. Garcia if he had been gone for a couple of days, right?
Could be.
It's also consistent with Luis Rivera lying, right?
I'll sustain the objection argument.
All right. You were asked questions. We're going to change gears here. We're done. Pulling that stuff up. You were asked questions about phone calls in between Miss McBanois' phone on June 5th and July 17th to a number 305-934-6615.
That's correct.
And it is your belief, it's your understanding, that that is Luis Rivera's phone.
It is my understanding that it was a previous phone number for him.
All right, now the way that you guys know that, when I say you guys, I'm talking about Tallahassee Police Department, a subpoena is sent to Apple, and in response you receive documents, right?
We did subpoena documents from Apple, yes. Or by subpoena or search warrant, yes.
Do you remember the phone number that you received back from Apple as belonging to Luis Rivera?
I did not receive those. I'm not sure, no.
Would it help you to take a look at the Apple response?
Sure.
Sergeant, if I can have it, sure to say. Would it help you to take a look at Agent Sanford's report?
What would help him? I mean, is this something you've dealt with before?
It is not, sir. I did not submit.
I don't know why we're asking this witness. He said he didn't request them, he didn't receive them, so I'm not sure why this witness is being asked about them.
don't know where.
Just because he testified about it, Your Honor,
About these records
about this phone number.
that you have in your hand?
Yes.
Stay.
I don't know what it is.
What?
I object to him being outside.
I was just saying, okay.
Sergeant, are you sure that that phone number actually belongs to Luis Rivera?
No, I'm not. I was advised by the investigators, who may have been the ones who obtained that document, that that was a phone number that was previously used by Mr. Rivera.
And the number that they gave you was 305-934-6615?
Well, let me double check that. (305-934-6615).
And that's a phone number that shows up in Catherine McVano's cell phone records or her call detail records for June 5th and July 17th.
That is correct.
Are you aware that Luis Rivera's actual phone number is 305-935-6615?
That was not the number I was provided.
That's a different phone number, right?
It is, yes.
Only a few moments, Your Honor.
Is there a question?
Just getting an exhibit marked, Your Honor. Sergeant, you were asked questions about iCloud information. You remember that?
Yes, I was.
Now, real briefly, if you could just explain to me. You guys sent a subpoena out to Apple to get iCloud information for Charles Adelson, right?
It would have been a search warrant, but yes.
Now, you get that information back, you use something called the Celebrite reader
Yes.
to then interpret that data.
I'm not sure if interpret is the right word, as opposed to make presentable to us.
So that you can navigate it and review it.
That's correct.
And you reviewed it in this case, right?
I reviewed portions of it, yes.
You were asked a question by Ms. Norris on direct examination if there was any evidence in that information of whether Sigfredo Garcia ever communicated with Charles Adelson. You remember that?
That's correct.
And your answer was no.
That's correct.
Judge, I'm going to request a sidebar.
All right. I'm gonna need to talk with the attorneys about this, and there's no sense keeping y'all around. Would y'all be offended if we broke a few minutes early? All right. See y'all tomorrow morning. Be back same time, same place. Don't discuss the case with anyone. You can step down the audience, sir.
Is that messy? Your Honor, can I add a note to that?
What's that?
Can I add something?
But we're going to hear from everybody. Right. So let me make sure I understand what you're saying. You're saying in the iCloud records of Adelson, Charles Adelson, it includes the substance of text messages between Magbanoa, your client, and Mr. Adelson, in which Adelson is saying he's talking to Mr. Garcia. Is that the sum and substance of what you're saying?
Correct, Your Honor. It begins with, and this is April 25th of 2014. weeks before the first trip to Tallahassee. The first text message from Catherine McBanwa to Charles Adelson, and this is the government's evidence that I'm reading from. Did Tuto call your phone? Answer from Charles Adelson, no. Answer, actually he did. Third answer, he invited me to go deep sea fishing. He was so nice. Response from Catherine to Charles Adelson, I'm serious. He's fucking driving me crazy. Second response from Catherine McBanwa, is your cell phone listed online? Response from Charles Adelson, I don't think my cell is listed online. This all occurs on April 25th, 2014. Your Honor, to add on that, the government during their direct examination of Sergeant Corbitt talked about how Sergeant Corbitt was able to access these same messages to determine that on 7/14 and 7/15 that they were having dinner. This is the government's exhibit. They've tried to move it in before. They've used it through this witness to reference other dates. This is being used in the same fashion, but more importantly, it's being used to impeach this witness because this witness said he reviewed all of this and that there is no evidence in there of communications in between Sequestration Garcia and Charles Adelson. Clearly, this impeaches that.
Mr. Norris?
Yes, sir. Cell phone listed online, and he responds, no, he doesn't think it's online. So I think that to offer this, it is not impeachment because Sergeant Corbitt said, I found no direct evidence of communication between the two. The content of this defendant's self-serving statements about whether or not he called is not evidence, and I don't believe that's why Sergeant Corbitt, or I do believe that's why he didn't consider it evidence of communication. And that's why I made my question about phone records and direct contacts in the iCloud between those respective parties. I think under 403, the probative value of this sarcastic exchange between the two is far outweighed by the danger of unfair prejudice, especially given the self-serving nature of it by Ms. McBanwa.
You got a brief response?
But Mr. Sanguinet has a stake in this too. He can be heard.
Thank you, Judge. Judge, at this time I've been instructed to withdraw my previous objection.
Let's have Sergeant Corbitt back up, if he would, please. No. Clarify for me. You made some, and unfortunately my notes aren't good enough. You can sit down. Sit down. Sorry. About a meeting at a restaurant with Miss McBanwa and Mr. Adelson. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yes, sir, I do.
I don't remember the specifics of that. What do you recall about that?
I believe it was the July 14th or 15th, that evening time, there was communication between Ms. McBanwa and Mr. Adelson, back and forth, and then after that, there was communication with Mr. Garcia. In trying to put some context to those communications, I did look at the iCloud for that night, and there's partial conversations about going out to dinner. We can eat somewhere around here. There was a location given where they could go to dinner. Again, just to put context to what we were looking at.
And these are the same records Mr. DeCoste is now talking about.
That's correct, sir.
Well, I think the state's opened the door to this. You can't use part of them and then tell the defense they can't use the other part of them. But you specifically elicited that testimony relying on what's in the iCloud records. So I'll overrule the objection. Anything else we need to resolve on this?
Judge, I would just ask that the defense review the exhibits one more time tonight.
I want you to put all the exhibits out. I don't want to hear about any more exhibits not being here. We do have one other issue, just to muddy the waters a little bit more. you'll have to talk to Sergeant Gore, who's in the back, as to the specifics of who's told him what, but apparently it's been reported to him, you can sit down, that's it, slide down, that 2 of the witnesses this morning violated the rule of sequestration by watching the other ones on the live stream while they were testifying. I don't want to start discussing it. I'll let y'all investigate what the situation is and who they're talking about. It does strike me now we've got 3 witnesses who conceivably we've had a sequestration problem. I'm going to remind everybody, it is your obligation to make sure your witnesses are told that they're under the rule of sequestration. If any of you have not specifically told your witnesses that, you need to make sure you do, because it's going to cause problems. And it appears perhaps there's a problem here. I'll let y'all look into that. We'll take it up at 8:30. I did want to comment on, I let in the tape this morning of the conversation between Ms. Johnston and Charlie Adelson. I did want to indicate my reasoning for that. I understand that under normal circumstance it would be hearsay, but my assessment of it is that it was not being offered for the truth of the matter asserted. It was being offered to show the reaction to the request for Ms. Magbanawala's records. Therefore, it's not hearsay. So that was the basis of my ruling. We'll see y'all at 8:30.
Have a good night, Your Honor.
Let's talk about it. I'm usually